Okay, let's talk about the stomach. So if you look here at the anatomy of the stomach, there are four main sections. So the first part is the cardia, and that's the area right as the esophagus enters the stomach there. That's an area where you're secreting a lot of mucus. Mucus is one of the ways that the stomach protects itself from the caustic, acidic environment that's there on the inside, right? We protect the rest of our body from that acidic environment by isolating it to the stomach, but you have to protect the stomach cells as well, so there's a layer of mucus on the inside, largely produced here. The fundus is the section up here, this little hump that's above the entrance to the esophagus. So cardia, fundus. The body is the bulk of this, right? It's a big part of the stomach. And then the pylorus is this part over here right before the exit where it sort of curves up like a J. And this is a look at an actual stomach in a cadaver. The muscles part of the stomach is part of the alimentary canal, so it has the same basic layers, but there are a few differences. So in the muscularis externa, which normally has two layers, the circular layer that can make the tube narrower, and the longitudinal layer which can make the tube shorter, you have an oblique layer as well, right? And that allows the stomach to really just mash and churn and mush down that food into what's called chyme, which is like a liquidy stuff that eventually will leave the stomach. You also have rugae, and rugae are wrinkles, and these are there because your stomach has to change size. When you haven't eaten in a while, your stomach is pretty small. When you put that Chipotle burrito in your mouth and swallow it, your stomach ends up having to get pretty big, and those rugae go away. And then you have a sphincter at the end of the pylorus region, which is called the pyloric sphincter. And this releases that chyme very slowly into the small intestines. One of the big functions of the stomach is food storage, right? So instead of having to eat just a little bit of food consistently throughout the day, so as not to overwhelm the capacity of our small intestines to break down and absorb food, we can eat a giant burrito 2 or 3 times a day, hold it in our stomach, and our stomach will release bits at a time into the small intestine. So again, you can see here the outer surface, right, is still serosa, and you have a greater curvature on the outside, which we talked about in the last video, and a lesser curvature on the inside here. But you have an extra third layer of muscle that's deep to the other 2 layers of muscle in the muscularis externa, called the oblique layer. And you can see these rugae, these folds as well. And if you look at this link below, on the actual PowerPoint, it takes you to an ESPN food exercise science thing about Joey Chestnut, who is the champion of the 4th of July hot dog eating contest. It is fascinating. So as I mentioned, one of the primary functions of the stomach is storage of that ingested food. But it also does some mechanical breakdown of the ingested food, right? It mashes it up, churns it with that extra layer of muscle. It also does some chemical digestion of food. We often think of the stomach as the site of chemical digestion of food. Really, the small intestines is where more of that happens. But we secrete an enzyme called pepsin in the stomach, which breaks peptide bonds. And peptide bonds are what hold proteins together. They hold amino acids together in a big polypeptide mixed protein. So proteins begin their chemical digestion in the stomach. There's also an enzyme called lingual lipase that, lingual refers to the tongue, and the tongue, there's an enzyme produced in your mouth called lingual lipase. Well, lipase breaks down lipids, but lingual lipase works optimally at a low pH, and your mouth is a relatively neutral pH. And so lingual lipase isn't particularly active until it reaches your stomach, and there it starts breaking down some fats. A fourth and lesser known function of the stomach, but very, very important, is the production of intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is not produced anywhere else in your body, and without it, you cannot survive. Intrinsic factor is necessary for the absorption, the effective absorption of vitamin B12. And vitamin B12 is necessary for a number of things, including the production of red blood cells, necessary for life, right? So, technically, storage of ingested food is important, but you could eat a little bit all day long. You can chew your food really well if you couldn't mechanically break it down in your stomach. You have other protein digesting enzymes in your small intestines, so really, oddly enough, the key feature of your stomach that is not replicated anywhere else is the production of intrinsic factor. If you look at your stomach, again, has the same four main layers. Has the mucosa on the inside, right? Submucosa below that, which is full of connective tissue, and that allows blood vessels and lymphatic cells and nerve plexuses to exist in that space. The muscularis externa, which is unique here because it has that oblique layer, and the serosa on the outside, which is that visceral peritoneum. So if you look at that, the stomach has all these pits here in the mucosa, right? This is the submucosa down here, but this is all mucosa up here, and these pits have lots of different kinds of cells that secrete gastric juices. Well, what kinds of cells and what makes up gastric juice? Well, you have parietal cells, and parietal cells produce hydrochloric acid, also intrinsic factor. Chief cells produce pepsinogen, which once it hits the acid turns into pepsin, which is the enzyme that breaks down proteins in your stomach. So those are two pretty important cells that are found in those gastric pits. There are also G cells, and G cells produce some hormones. So one of the ways that you know that you are hungry or not hungry is based on the stretching of your stomach or the lack of stretching. And G cells respond to that by secreting a hormone called gastrin that we'll talk about later, and some other hormones. And again, chief cells produce pepsinogen, as I said. And I don't need you to memorize where those are in these pits, but they are in the pits. You also have a bunch of cells in the pits that undergo mitosis. You have to very frequently replace these cells in your stomach because your stomach is a dangerous place to be with all that acid. So again, you have a mucus layer protecting those cells, but you also are frequently undergoing mitosis. How do we produce hydrochloric acid? Well, you have CO2 and H2O that come together to make H2CO3, which generally becomes bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. You take that hydrogen ion and add a chloride ion and pump it into the lumen of the stomach, and thereby getting hydrochloric acid. Now, your small intestines has some unique features that are mostly there to give it extra surface area, because your small intestines are where the majority of the digestion occurs, chemical digestion, but it's also where essentially all of the absorption occurs. And to absorb all that stuff into your blood supply, you need a lot of surface area. So not only are your intestines really long and windy, right, which increases surface area, but along the walls you have these circular folds. So I'll show you an image in a second. I'll just show an image now. These circular folds here increase the surface area. You also have what are called villi, and you can see here's a circular fold a little bit bigger with a bunch of little villi, like finger-like projections. This is a closer look at those villi. Those villi drastically increase the surface area. Now you can also see this is all in the mucosa, right? All these villi. In your mucosa you have the epithelial layer, you have the muscularis mucosa here, and then you have the submucosa here and the muscularis externa here, circular longitudinal layer, and the serosa on the outside. And you also have, in those villi, you have lacteals, and we've talked about lacteals before. They are lymphatic capillaries that are next to the normal capillaries, which you have there, and the normal capillaries are picking up all of those nutrients, essentially, right? Amino acids and glucose and nucleic acids, things like that. The lacteal is there largely to pick up fats, which are way too big to be absorbed by the blood capillaries. But on each of the villi, those finger-like projections, those villi are lined with cells which themselves have microvilli. And microvilli are little extensions of the actual cell membrane, so they're very tiny. So we have circular folds that go around the outside, we have villi, and on the cells that line the villi, we have little microvilli. Tons of surface area, and these microvilli look kind of like a brush, so they're often called the brush border, because they are on the border of your small intestines. And so if you see, this is a villus, you can see the lacteal and the blood capillaries. And if you see these, they almost look like they have a fuzz on the outside of them. Looks like it could be cilia, but it's not cilia. They don't move. They're just there for surface area. They are the brush border. And the brush border has not only a lot of surface area for absorption, it also has enzymes on it to do the last bit of digestion that you need. So you've been breaking down polysaccharides like starch into smaller and smaller polysaccharides, and eventually into disaccharides, like 2 glucose molecules long. And these enzymes in the brush border, called brush border enzymes, will break that last disaccharide into just individual glucose molecules, which are then small enough to absorb across this wall and into here to be picked up by those blood capillaries. So most of your digestion occurs in the small intestines, and the vast majority of nutrient absorption occurs there. A little bit happens in the large intestine. Those are special situations that we'll talk about. But there are 3 main segments: the duodenum, and the jejunum, and the ileum. And you can see them right here. Right? Your duodenum is really just this first part. So your stomach would be right here. It's the first part where that chyme leaves your stomach and enters the small intestines. So what has to happen there? Well, first of all, you have to have alkaline secretions that neutralize that acidic chyme that's coming from your stomach so it doesn't destroy your small intestines. This is also where your pancreatic juices get dumped in here, and that's important because your pancreatic juices have tons of different kinds of enzymes that break down lipids, called pancreatic lipase, enzymes that break down proteins, we call them trypsin and chymotrypsin, enzymes that break down starch, pancreatic amylase, which is a lot like salivary amylase, but it's made by the pancreas, and nucleases, which break down nucleotides. So this is where we dump everything in and it gets mixed together. Then you have your jejunum, which is the next part. And your jejunum is where the majority of your breakdown and the majority of your absorption occurs. So the jejunum has lots and lots of surface area. So this is where you have the most circular folds. This is where you have the most villi. Again, those finger-like villi and microvilli. And this is really the business end of your intestines. And then in the ileum, which is actually the longest part, it's the last part, you finish up the absorption, essentially. You do the rest of the absorption. You don't have nearly as many circular folds or villi. Right? The villi that you do have are smaller and stumpier, and you don't have as much surface area. But you do have lots of lymphoid nodules. So let me move this here so you can see this, right? This makes sense because you have been collecting bacteria along the way. And again, most of them are not necessarily harmful, but they could be, and it's important to have lymphoid nodules along the way. So as you get to the ileum, which is the last part of the small intestines, we have lots of these. So this is an actual look at your duodenum, your jejunum, and your ileum, and you can see how many more circular folds, how much more surface area, how much bigger the villi are there in your jejunum.